I'm delighted to welcome Professor Anand Vaidya to the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. He's the Director of Comparative Philosophy at San Jose University, and he's got interest in epistemology and modalism, I was reading, and I also think in metaphysical realism, I suspect, too. So I'm delighted that he's able to give this lecture to us, and he's going to be speaking about locating Nyaya epistemology within the map of contemporary analytical epistemology, Gangesha's attention-first epistemology. So Professor Vaidya, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies and to have spent the past, 2.5 months of my sabbatical in Oxford. And this is going to be a talk that culminates not only the past several months of research, but probably close to about 10 years of flying back between India and America to try and figure out these issues. So this is sort of the culmination of a lot of stuff, but as usual with talks like this is just the current state of what I think. It could be the case that things change again in another couple of years, or maybe right after this talk. Okay, so the goal of what I want to do is talk about Nyaya epistemology within the framework of contemporary analytic epistemology. I'll be moving between discussion of Gangesha as a particular figure in the Navya Nyaya component of Nyaya philosophy, but for the purposes of what I'm doing, it won't really be necessary for me to distinguish very carefully between Nyaya in general and Gangesha and specific, because I'm trying to locate the general contours of the epistemology of the school within contemporary analytic epistemology. All right, so if you're someone who's familiar not with analytic epistemology but with Indian epistemology, you'll know that there are several central debates in what is known as Pramanashastra or Pramanavada. So what we're talking about in these cases are the sources of knowledge, the debate over intrinsic versus extrinsic validity, the debate over whether perception and perceptual error have a certain nature, and what is the best explanation of perceptual error, and then the debate over what the relationship is between perception and sources of knowledge. So these are 4 debates that happen across all of the major schools of Indian epistemology, and I'm going to bring some of the components of those debates into conversation with analytic epistemology. So, in analytic epistemology, we've been concerned with the analysis of knowledge. Is knowledge composed of parts, and if so, what are they? We've also been concerned with the question of whether or not knowledge of P entails knowledge of P, what's known as a KK principle. We've been interested in the analysis of justification, the analysis of perception. In this case, we're wondering if it's a disjunctive relation in relationship to perceptual error, or is perception a fallible process, which is sometimes correct and other times incorrect. And then we have the relationship between perception and knowledge. Is perception a basis for knowing, or is perception a way of knowing? So in relationship to what I've already said, I want to point out one very interesting idea. So in Indian epistemology at number 2, we have a debate over intrinsic versus extrinsic validity. And in analytic epistemology, we have a discussion between whether or not justification is understood on an internalist or an externalist model. There was a long time where people thought that, in fact, these 2 debates in Indian epistemology and analytic epistemology were the same. But it actually turns out that the debate between Svata Pramanya and Parata Pramanya in Indian philosophy is not the same debate as the one between internalism and externalism in analytic philosophy. So so that we can see some similarities in questions being asked, but sometimes the way in which they actually end up being debated shows that there's actually a significant subtle difference of what's going on. Okay, so 4 paradigms that we find in contemporary analytic epistemology can be categorized in terms of what is taken to be sort of basic or the primary thing that's being used to analyze other things. So in belief-first epistemology, beliefs are basic and the properties of them are what we try to analyze. In agent-first epistemology, or what it's known as virtue epistemology, agents are taken to be basic, and then we analyze aspects of agency in relationship to epistemology. In knowledge-first epistemology, we talk about knowledge being basic, and then we try to analyze other phenomena like justification, evidence, and belief in terms of a relationship to knowledge. And then separately from these 3 categorizations of epistemologies, there is a debate about whether perception is disjunctive, and I'm going to explain what that means in detail soon. But one of the ideas is whether or not perception should be understood as something that's like a success term, where it's factive, and it's distinct from the cases where it's false, and there's no common kind between these. So I'll get into that debate shortly. But these are four sort of major moves that are currently discussed in analytic epistemology. And my goal now is to try and locate the Nyaya school, and Gangesha in particular, in relationship to these. So let me give a little bit more sort of texture to what are these four basic movements. So one massive proponent of the belief first epistemology is a former teacher of mine, Tyler Burge, at the University of California, Los Angeles. And on his theory of epistemology, he offers a componential view of knowledge where it's composed of parts, and he thinks basically that belief is the primary site of epistemic action, and knowledge is to be understood as warranted true belief, where warrant is not a factive relation, meaning that it doesn't imply the truth automatically. Then he defines two different sorts of ways in which a belief can be supported. Those two types of warrants are called justifications, and the other one is called entitlements. And he is against the idea that we can understand perception as being disjunctive. Another prominent epistemologist is Ernie Souza, and he's what would be categorized as an agent-first epistemologist because he falls in the virtue epistemology camp. He also offers a componential view of knowledge that includes belief. He takes agency to be central to knowledge and the basic thing in virtue of which we sort of analyze other epistemic phenomena. And he maintains that there are two kinds of knowledge. One is called animal and the other one is called reflective. He is also against disjunctivism about perception. And then we have sitting here with us Tim Williamson, who defends a knowledge-first epistemology, does not offer a componential view of knowledge as composed of parts. He takes knowledge to be basic and not include belief as a mental state. He maintains that knowledge equals evidence and maintains that perception is factive and a way of knowing. And then we have John McDowell, who is probably the contemporary sort of preeminent person who defends disjunctivism about perception by arguing against what's known as the highest common factor argument against disjunctivism. He takes perception to be a capacity for knowledge, maintains that perception provides us reasons that can justify our beliefs, and maintains that perceptual content is fully and always conceptual. So already in presenting these four sort of paradigms of analytic epistemology, there are already connections that can be brought in with various schools of Indian epistemology. So now I'm going to focus down on Nyaya in particular, and in specific detail, Gangesha's work. So, we need to first look at how to analyze Nyaya in relationship to these four paradigms. And already we know that in the 20th century there are many people who have contributed to the scholarship on Nyaya outside of the primary texts. Now, some of these people, like Motilal and Mohanty, have already written at length about how it connects to various schools in analytic epistemology. But I am not going to focus on these figures, and it's not because I think what they say is incorrect. It's just because there's a primary source for me of influence, and that is these two figures. So I'm going to focus on the work of Stephen Phillips and on J. Shankar Shah, and I'm going to talk about how their interpretations of Nyaya and Gangesha relate to elements that we find in Burge, Souza, Williamson, and McDowell. And I'm also going to show how Nyaya and Gangesha is interestingly different, though he shares elements in common with these figures. And I'm also going to place how Nyaya is relevant to contemporary debates in analytic epistemology. And also, by saying that, I'm trying to say that when we do epistemology, we should really understand it in a global context. So it's like putting Nyaya in conversation with analytic epistemology in a global context, not in as just an analytic context. That's sort of the goal of what I'm trying to do. Okay. So, to do this, we need to look at 5 theses that are found in Nyaya and Gangesha. And what we need to do is we need to look at each of these theses and see how they connect specifically with the work of the 4 paradigms that I mentioned in analytic epistemology. So the 5 theses are: knowledge sources are factive, perception is a direct source of knowledge, perception is disjunctive. There are two kinds of knowledge, certified and uncertified, and there are two kinds of uncertified knowledge, stative and episodic. So I will go through each of these and then show through commentary how they're related to the four paradigms. Okay. So perhaps one of the most interesting places to begin the discussion is with the claim that the knowledge sources are factive, or pramana are factive. So in 2004, Stephen Phillips did a translation of Gangesha, and in this translation, he translated some of the concepts, such that the notion of pramana ended up being factive. And in 2007, Janardhan Ganeri, working off Mohanty's 1968 translation, critically challenged Phillips and his student Matthew Dosty's view by arguing that this isn't the correct interpretation of how Gangesha is understanding the notion of knowledge sources. And so the argument was basically from Ganeri that they are non-factive, or they're not factive, and from Phillips and Dosty it is that they are factive. So the debate that occurs between Phillips, Dosty, and Ganeri is interestingly connected to a debate that occurs primarily between Tyler Burge and John McDowell about whether or not disjunctivism is true. In fact, the moves that are made by Ganeri are very similar to the moves made by Burge. So McDowell is a proponent of disjunctivism, and Burge is an anti-disjunctivist. Ganeri is sort of taking a position that's similar to Burge, and Phillips is taking a position that's similar to McDowell. And the way in which the two figures in the two traditions debate each other is very similar. And it has to do with the idea of whether or not we can understand fallibility and infallibility, and how it relates to the concepts of processes and products. So do we say that a process is fallible? Can we say that a product is fallible? Do we say that a process is infallible? Do we say that a product is infallible? So I'm not going to go into detail on this debate now, although I just recently finished a paper discussing precisely the connections between the figures in this debate. But the general idea here is that the claim that knowledge sources are factive as a debate concerning how to interpret Nyaya is very clearly relevant to the debate that's occurring between McDowell and Burge about whether or not perception, for example, is disjunctive. So if you take the claim now, we assume that Phillips is correct, that knowledge sources are factive. There's a simple application that gets us to perception being factive, which is perception is the source of knowledge. Gangesha clearly thinks this is true. Sources of knowledge are factive. That's Phillips' interpretation of Gangesha. That's going to lead us to the conclusion that perception is factive. Now, there are two ways to understand the claim that sources of knowledge are factive, or that perception is factive. And I want to now give a way of thinking about it that I've come up with over the years. And that is to contrast two different ways of understanding sources of knowledge. One of them is called the elemental assembly model, and the other one is called the source positional model. So if I told you that there was some water in a well down the street, and what you did was you walked over and you found that there was only liquid hydrogen in the well, and then I said to you, well, you can make water by doing something to the liquid hydrogen, you might have think I sort of misled you by telling you that there was water in the well. So if I tell you that perception is a source of knowledge, and then what I mean by that is that you go get perception and you do something to it, and that along with other things will make knowledge for you, I might have misled you in a certain way. So that's the elemental conception. The elemental conception of a source of knowledge is that it provides you with an element for assembling it along with other things. That can be contrasted with the source or positional model, where I say, if you go to the well, you get the water. If you go to perception, you get the knowledge, right? Because perception is a source of knowledge. So when I'm saying that perception is a source of knowledge, in Gangesha's way of thinking about it, it's the source conception, not the elemental conception. There's no assembly required. If anything's required, it's putting yourself in a position to access the source. So that if you're in the right position and you access the source, what you access is the knowledge directly. It's not something that you construct and put together. So this, I think, is very clearly the interpretation we should be taking of Phillips's claim that Gangesha thinks knowledge sources are factive. There's another way of talking about this. So one way of talking about it could be by contrasting an indirect and a direct model. So on an indirect model, perception is a way of justifying a belief, or it's a way of entitling a belief, because it's a way of having a basis for a belief. The belief is the mental state that turns into knowledge, and what we do is we take perception either as entitling the belief or as in justifying the belief, and then we make knowledge through this process. That can be contrasted with a direct model, where the perceiving in and of itself just is the knowing. Seeing that P is just a way of knowing that P. It's not a basis for believing it. It's just that when it satisfies certain conditions, the seeing itself is the knowing. In the language of how Gungesha ends up talking, it'll be the case that the vertical awareness, which I'm now going to talk about in more detail, just is the knowing. So the contrast between the indirect and the direct model is that in the indirect model, we're assembling something. And in the direct model, we're not assembling something. My understanding of Phillips's interpretation of Gungesha is that he favors the direct model, that Gungesha is a proponent of that. Okay, so my understanding now of the analytic debates is that Burge and Sosa favor the indirect model. For Burge, the belief is what is basic, and then there are two different ways of supporting the belief. One is through justification, and one is through entitlement. But that approach is favoring the indirect model, and I think Sosa also favors this idea that we're doing it indirectly and not directly. It's a little bit less clear in Sosa's work, because when you're an agent-first epistemologist, your whole way of talking about epistemology is different than when you're a belief-first epistemologist. But nevertheless, at least one thing that's in common between Burge and Sosa is they both think that warrant is non-factive. Okay, so Williamson, I believe, holds a direct model, and I think it's much closer to Gungesha's view, and I think in some sense the relationship that Gungesha conceives of in terms of perceiving and knowing, if anything, fits very closely to Williamson's view in his book, Knowledge and Its Limits. So there are subtle differences between Williamson and Gungesha's view, which at the end of this talk I'm going to spend a lot of time exemplifying in detail through argumentation. And there also serve as corrections to my earlier work, where I thought there was one relationship between Williamson's work and Gungesha's, and now I see there's a more subtle relationship that needs to be teased out. Okay, so now we're on to the claim that's very central to McDowell's work, disjunctivism. So when people talk about disjunctivism, what they're trying to talk about is that there are good cases of perceiving and there are bad cases of perceiving. This is like the language that analytic philosophers use. We often just say the good case versus the bad case. And at least one important factor in the good case is that it's veridical, and in the bad case, it's non-veridical. So the good case and the bad case at least seem to have one of the features that we like to talk about between them, which is that phenomenologically they seem similar. So the bad case, the yellow lemon, is present somehow in your experience, and the good case, the yellow lemon, is also present somehow in your experience. And then there's a big debate about exactly what we mean by saying those two things. So a historically important argument that I believe was debated between A.J. Ayer and J.L. Austin at one period in time leads to what is known as the highest common factor view between the good case and the bad case. So the idea is that the good case and the bad case, having the experience of the yellow lemon, are first-person phenomenologically indistinguishable. I can't tell from the inside whether I'm in a good case or a bad case. If two states have this property of being first-person phenomenologically indistinguishable, then they should be categorized as falling under a common epistemic kind. If I can't tell from the inside what's going on, then it should be the case that the same kind of epistemic profile is present. 3, if two states fall under the same epistemic kind, then they provide the same epistemic warrant. That is, what I'm entitled to believe or what I can justify my belief with is the same in both cases. So the good case and the bad case provide the same epistemic warrant. So this is an argument. Sometimes it's called the argument from illusion, I believe, but it's the more common version is the highest common factor view of what's going on in experience. Okay, so one thing to pay attention to that's important in the Nyaya tradition is that when, I'm going to back up real quickly to this one again. So the good case here was a veridical case of seeing a lemon, and the bad case here was a perfect hallucination of seeing a lemon. And it's very important that I use that word, a perfect case, of illusion, a perfect case of hallucination of a yellow lemon. Okay, so one of the things that's important in Nyaya, which has taken me a lot of time to figure out, is exactly what they think about the nature of hallucination. So one scholar, Prabal Kumar Sen, who's very well respected as a Nyayika, has told me that the Nyaya tradition never thought to theorize about hallucination because of their realism. They thought hallucination weren't even cases worth considering in the epistemology of. And in fact, there's this idea that what is really going on for Nyaya is that there are illusions, and they spend a lot of time explaining illusions in terms of what's known as the misplacement theory of illusion, which was popularized by Motilal in his book Perception. But there was no real discussion of hallucination. However, another scholar, Nilanjan Das, showed that in fact in Jayanta Bhatt you can find a discussion of hallucination. It's of a dead lover being presented against a wall due to grief. And it's important to recognize that if in Nyaya there is a discussion of hallucination, it seems to be that the cases of hallucination they are going to be interested in discussing are ones where they're of a prior object that was veridically experienced, which is now presented against a background where there is no perceptual anchor. So just take the concept of what's known as an anchor-dependent illusion and an anchor-independent illusion. If I'm looking at a rope presented as a snake, when I move my field of vision, the snake illusion should go away because the snake is dependent on the anchor being the rope. In an anchor-independent illusion, if as I move my field of vision, it should be the case that the false appearance continues to be presented. So in the case of the dead lover that Jayanta Bhatt is imagining against the wall, the way in which they're thinking about it is it's an anchor-independent illusion because it's of a particular that was experienced veridically in the past, but there's no support or anchor in the present case. So their notion of a hallucination, in my interpretation, what Nyayakas are interested in, is they're really interested in the idea of an anchor-independent illusion. But it's always these illusions that are primarily what they're trying to explain. Okay, so they don't think that the contemporary discussion of perfect hallucinations, which are sort of these cases where somehow a neuroscientist gets into your visual cortex and forces you to have a perception of a yellow lemon, are really the type of thing that perceptual science or perceptual vision or sort of the epistemology of perception should be focused on. That's my understanding of where they stand on that issue. Okay, so the other thing that's important from Nyaya epistemology is there seems to be a distinction that we oftentimes have in analytic epistemology between talking about the good case and the bad case as a bivalent and exhaustive taxonomy between veridical and non-veridical cases. There seems to be good evidence for the fact that in Nyaya there is a trivalent dichotomy. You can talk about the veridical case and you can talk about a non-veridical case, but you can also talk about dubious cases of perception. And I have a long paper on this called Three Kinds of Doubt, comparing Nyaya and Descartes, where I discuss in detail a very famous example that the Nyayakas talk about, which is seeing a person as a post, or having the dubious perception that there's something that's either a post or a person in the distance. So what is the way to understand the nature of dubious perception where it's not parasitic on veridical and non-veridical perception, but is its own general kind that is carving the space of perceptual states in an important way? So the way to think about it is by thinking about the difference between what's known as esoteric content and erotetic content. So in esoteric content, what we have are assertions. There is a post there. There is a person there. In erotetic content, we have something X is either F or G, and it arises in the force of a question. So one way of understanding the post as a person, example in Indian philosophy, is thinking that what's happening is that you're seeing a post at a moment, then you're seeing a person at a moment, and you're oscillating between the two. The interpretation that I think is more accurate is that what's happening is you're seeing something where your conscious arises with the question, is it a post or a person? And then it vacillates between thinking about it being a post or being a person. But the interrogative or erotetic state is primary, not the assertive state. And so by taking dubious cognitions to be ones that have a fundamental questioning nature at their basis, I think the Nyaya draw a distinction between veridical and non-veridical by talking in addition about another class, the dubious kind. So that's another distinction. So the two main claims I've made here that are relevant is that, one, they're not really going to talk about perfect hallucinations. That's not really a case that they're interested in analyzing. They're going to talk about anchor-independent illusions. And then in addition, they're not going to see a bivalent nature to perceptual states just in terms of vertical or non-vertical. They're going to see a third category called dubious. There's some evidence to suggest that in contemporary analytic philosophy, there is now discussion of something called uncertain perception or probabilistic perception. There's some way in thinking maybe that's the same kind of phenomenon they're thinking about. Okay, so John McDowell famously responded to the highest common factor argument by saying that perception is a capacity for knowledge. Mere appearances are metaphysically distinct from perceptions. Mere appearances do not have the same warrant as perceptions. Perceptual experience is non-factorizable. His main claim was, at least my interpretation, first-person phenomenological indistinguishability between the hallucination of a yellow lemon and a vertical case of a yellow lemon is not sufficient to ground the claim that they share a common epistemic kind. So he kind of pushed back in 1996 in Mind and World against this sort of way of thinking about perception. And there's a nice way to think about what might be supporting the underlying theory he has. So if you think about the example of jade as a jewel, which for a long time was indistinguishable between the two subkinds it has, jadeite and nephrite, which have different chemical compositions, you can see that there's an issue here. So jade and nephrite are phenomenologically indistinguishable. But then we can ask ourselves the question, how should we taxonomize jewels in terms of their macroscopic appearances or in terms of their microstructure? And it seems like we do it in terms of their microstructure. And if they're microstructure, they are distinguishable. So in fact, although jade and nephrite look the same, they are fundamentally different kinds of things. There's a way of thinking about perception the same way. The yellow lemon case that's veridical and the non-veridical case, superficially, first person are indistinguishable. So in some sense, you can say, look, hey, from this level of classification, they are the same. But if you say, what is their underlying nature? Well, one is true and one is false. And if what matters is their epistemological bearing on us, and truth and falsity are epistemically important, which they are, then it seems like you would want to individuate in terms of the underlying thing. So there's a way of saying that just as jade cuts into jadeite and nephrite, perception cuts into the good case and the bad case. So this is a way of supporting the idea that there's something intuitive to saying that even though things are superficially similar at one level, the real taxonomy of them is at another level, and perception should be thought of like jade. Even though it's superficially similar between the good case and the bad case, the good case and the bad case are really different. Okay, so Stephen Phillips around 2005-06 started saying that it is true that in fact Gangesha is a disjunctivist. So he made this claim specifically, and his student Matthew Dosti actually made this claim specifically in a paper about the Nyaya tradition. And when I first read Matthew's paper in 2012, I actually wrote a response saying that this is incorrect, and in fact Nyayikas are not disjunctivists. And one of the reasons I wrote that paper was because I was motivated by Tyler Burge's extensive criticism of disjunctivism as an implausible theory because it was inconsistent with the proximality principle in vision science. And so having studied with him and having read a lot of his work, I came to this, I was like, okay, well maybe they're rushing to think that Gangesha is a disjunctivist when in fact the evidence might support the fact that he has another view, anti-individualism, which is what Burge advocates. And in my paper, in fact, I defended the claim that all the evidence that Matthew cited stood in favor of the view that actually Gangesha was an anti-individualist and not a disjunctivist. It was only then in 2013 I began this long process which has led a decade, I guess it's 2023 now, to me trying to figure this out. I still to this day don't know if I would say Gangesha is a disjunctivist, but if he is a disjunctivist, he's a very specific kind of disjunctivist, which took me about 4 years to figure out. So let me give you the rundown of what's going on in his view. So in analytic epistemology, we can at least distinguish between what's known as epistemic disjunctivism and metaphysical disjunctivism. So Duncan Pritchard is an advocate of epistemic disjunctivism, which is basically the claim that the difference between the good case and the bad case is in terms of epistemic warrant. But it's not in terms of some underlying metaphysical state. It's not about state differences, it's about warranting differences. And then if we take McDowell around 1996 from Mind and World, we can say that he is a metaphysical disjunctivist. This is precisely what Pritchard argues against. He argues that, in fact, he's an epistemic disjunctivist, but McDowell is a metaphysical disjunctivist. And then if we join McDowell's claim with a view that Paul Grice defended about causation and its role in perception, we can get to this nice view called SFM disjunctivism, which is single-factor metaphysical disjunctivism. What comes out of Grice is the idea that when I'm seeing something, for that thing to be what my visual state is about, it has to be in the causal etiology of the thing that I'm claiming I see. So I see the cup on the table means that the cup played a causal role in my perception of the cup. Right? So that's single factor metaphysical disjunctivism, because it's saying that the factor that's relevant is causation from the cup to me. Okay? Now, the type of disjunctivism that the Nyayikas are interested in is neither epistemic nor single factor. It's multi-factor causal disjunctivism. So in a sense, they agree with McDowell, but they don't think that there's just one factor that's relevant. They think there are many factors that are relevant. Okay, so what are the factors that they think are relevant? Here is the list. And now this list does not come to us from Gangesha. It comes from work done by J. Shankar Shah, where he has excavated it, I believe, from an exchange between a Samkhya theorist and a Nyayika in a debate. So Jay has extracted these conditions from that area. So the conditions in multi-factor causal disjunctivism are the presence of a self, the presence of properly functioning internal sense organs, the presence of properly functioning external sense organ, contact between the external sense organ and the object, contact between the external sense organ and the internal sense organ, contact between internal sense organ and the self. Now, the ones that are in color are the ones I want to spend a couple of seconds sort of elaborating. So the presence of the self causes some problems for Buddhists because they think there isn't a permanent self, so that has to be flagged. Contact between the external sense organ and the object is partly due to the fact that Nyayikas were extra-omission theorists of perception, but extra-omission theories of perception are just scientifically implausible. So in a paper I just finished writing, I've defended the idea that you can actually drop this specific condition from the Nyaya theory and come up with a much better account of direct realism for them that uses a different view. It's a view actually that's defended by a philosopher at Oxford. His name is Anil Gomes. So I basically used part of his theory to defend a replacement for that one. The other two are the ones that I think actually in English connote the idea of attention. Okay, so one of the big themes of my talk is locating Gangesha as an attention-first theorist in epistemology. And how do I do that? It's by looking at the last two positive conditions, right? So those two positive conditions, when I understand them properly, they are actually just a theory of what is basic constituents of attention. Contact between the external sense organ and the internal sense organ, and contact between the internal sense organ and the self are just two ways of having a larger set that captures what we mean by attention. Final point, these conditions are not meant to be, or they need not be understood as being necessary and sufficient conditions for the proper causation of the visual experience of seeing a cup on a table. Rather, they're a template of two distinct kinds of factors that, when satisfied in concert, allow us to say that you're seeing the cup on the table. And now I'll go into detail about how that relates to knowledge. Okay, so first, seeing Nyaya as an attention-first epistemology is recognizing that for them, that perception, when it's a source of knowledge, is when perception is in the scope of attention. Those are grounded in those last two claims on the positive condition. And this makes the case that when we're talking about perception as a source of knowledge, that in the sense that I defined earlier, where it's a source and a positional way of thinking about it and not an assembly way, it's because perception has been in the scope of attention. Okay, so Now we're going to move on to the theory of knowledge and how it connects. So, Gangesha specifically defines two different types of knowledge, certified and uncertified. That allows for the following two claims to be made, one of which is true, the first one, the second one is false. So if S has certified knowledge that P, then S has uncertified knowledge that P, that's true. If S has uncertified knowledge that P, then S has certified knowledge that P, that's false. What does that basically mean? It means that certified knowledge is parasitically dependent on uncertified knowledge. But uncertified knowledge is a genuine kind of knowledge that does not depend on certification. Certification is something that happens later on. It may or may not happen, but uncertified knowledge being genuine is just done in terms of the causal profile of how the source was activated. Certified knowledge has to do with exchanges of reasons, and I mean, if in analytic epistemology, you could think of it this way. This is actually what Stephen Phillips says, although it's complicated in some ways, but a rough way of thinking of this is that uncertified knowledge captures for Gangesha the externalist theory of justification or knowledge, and certified knowledge is parasitic on uncertified knowledge and captures the internalist component of knowledge in Gangesha. So that's sort of what's going on. So if you look back to what I said about Tyler Burge, I said Tyler Burge says that there are two types of warrants. One kind is justification and the other kind is entitlement. And in Burge's theory, entitlement is an externalist type of warrant and justification is an internalist type of warrant. In Gangesha, what's going on is that uncertified knowledge is a type of externalist connection and certified knowledge is a type of internalist connection. And Stephen Phillips pretty much says as much in his explanations of Gangesha. Okay, so what the two kinds of knowledge are not. So for those familiar with analytic epistemology, you might think, well, it's also true in analytic epistemology that we draw a distinction between two kinds of knowledge. But one distinction that we draw is a distinction between a priori and a posteriori knowledge, and it's very clear that Gangesha does not intend this at all. There's nothing about the presence or absence of sense experience in the type of knowledge that's relevant for what Gangesha is talking about. And in addition, it might be the case that the a priori, a posteriori distinction is not joint carving as an account of knowledge, and arguably what Gangesha is talking about, uncertified versus certified, can be argued to be joint carving. And by joint carving, I mean taking into consideration that epistemology is a science of the nature of knowing. Gangesha's distinction might be capturing actually the right way to draw the map, and the a priori, a posteriori one is arguably something that is not drawing the map the correct way. More relevantly, Stephen Phillips has claimed that Ernie Souza's distinction between animal and reflective knowledge is very closely connected to Gangesha's distinction between uncertified and certified. However, there's a subtle correction that has to be made here, is that if Souza believes that that on his theory warrant is non-factive, and Gangesha thinks that knowledge sources are factive, it couldn't really be the case that Souza's distinction is that closely connected to what's going on with Gangesha. And so this is something I think that Stephen has spent time trying to figure out, but my own analysis leads me to believe that Gangesha is a bit further away from Souza than Stephen thinks. The similarity is that animality and reflection do map two properties of uncertified and certified. In reflective knowledge and in certified, reasons are at play, and in animal and uncertified, reasons aren't at play. But that doesn't mean that the underlying nature of how they conceive of knowledge is the same, because Souza's is non-factive and Gangesha's is factive. So we'll get into that in a minute. Okay, now on to the closing claims. There are two types of uncertified knowledge, stative and episodic. So we need to understand this in terms of several theses. Okay, so there's two kinds of uncertified. One, the stative kind, does include belief, and the other kind, the episodic, does not include belief. And one kind, the episodic, causes the other kind. And now you can see that there's a kind of structure going on here where the most basic thing in Gangesha's epistemology is episodic uncertified knowledge, which then causes stative uncertified knowledge, And because certified knowledge entails uncertified knowledge, the episodic uncertified knowledge bears a relationship to what is going to hold for stative certified knowledge. It's going to go up. The most basic relation for Gangesha is going to be episodic uncertified knowledge. All right, so let's walk through these claims and close it out. Okay, so Phillips basically just says that uncertified knowledge includes belief. And basically, there's the definition. So here's the correction. In my 2020 piece on Gangesha and Tim Williamson's theory of knowledge, first epistemology, I accidentally claimed that Gangesha's view of certified knowledge was this definition. But in fact, that's incorrect. This is his definition of uncertified knowledge. And now the reason why it's confusing is because, as you'll see in a moment, the difference between stative and episodic is central to actually Indian epistemology. And if you don't pay attention to the differences between episodic theories of knowing and stative theories of knowing, you can easily fall into one of these traps. One of the best ways to think about this connection is in terms of production. So, knowledge sources are factive, that's what Gangesha says. Perception is a knowledge source, Gangesha says that also. Knowledge sources produce true beliefs, Phillips says that. So perception produces true belief. From the interpretation I gave earlier, perception is a direct source of knowledge. So perceptual knowledge produces true belief. So this is again talking about the basic way that perception relates to the production of true belief. So, one way to think about the episodic nature of what's going on is by noting that Karl Popper wrote a very important paper about epistemology, comparing it to analytic epistemology in the 80s. And he listed out a number of features of Indian epistemology outside of Nyaya that sort of put pressure on the idea that there really could be compared. And there's something to what he's saying that is correct, but there's also something that you can push through and sort of analyze in more detail. So one of the things that you can look at in Indian epistemology that's very sometimes hard to understand in analytic epistemology is sort of the idea that knowledge is always a fresh news. This is the word Stephen Phillips uses. And the idea is that there's something new that correlates with knowing. And knowledge requires that something new is being given. I guess the way to think about it that I oftentimes use is if I'm looking at one object in my environment stably over time, you might say at the first moment of awareness that's veridical, I come to know of the presence of a cup on a table. But as time goes forward, it's not new information given that I haven't moved my field of vision or anything. And so according to this way of thinking about knowledge in Indian epistemology, it's like, yeah, you knew it in the first moment, but then as you continue to look at it, it isn't the case that there's any knowledge coming in, but there's nothing new going on. So one way to solve this problem that has been debated between Mimamsakas and Nyayikas is to think that time is actually a component of what you perceive as you see an object over time. And since the time is always changing, there is something always new when we're perceiving one and the same object over time. This is actually part of one of the interesting debates. But that part is not really the more interesting thing I think that's going on here. What's really going on here is that stative knowledge is secondarily and derivatively understood in Nyaya against the background of the episodic case. So the episodic case is what is basic. So if someone wants to say, no, actually Nyayikas understand stative knowledge just fine, the argument that comes from my understanding of Stephen Phillips's work is simply because of the fresh news component, it must be the episodic is primary and the stative is secondary. Now, this actually helps because stative knowledge for Gangesha has true belief as a component. It has belief as a component. So the idea is that belief is correct to be understood as the main site when we're talking about stative knowledge, because belief is stative, but when we're talking about the knowing part, it's the episodic part that's coming first. Okay, so here are some actual claims from Phillips about Gangesha. Knowledge is awareness of something there where it is. Awareness with F as predication content about an object that it is F. Second, true beliefs are formed by episodes of occurrent knowledge. defined as vertical awareness embedding a true proposition that is produced by a veritable knowledge source. More importantly, he just says, knowledge is not a species of belief. Knowledge is a species of mental event, not of belief, although a certain range of mental states, thoughts, testimonial comprehensions, inferences, perceptions have belief propositional content. So here, this passage I'm focusing on because sometimes it's hard to understand exactly which way Stephen is hedging in his translation of the Sanskrit. But the way in which I think correctly I now see it is that if you just distinguish between the stative case and the episodic case, this passage should be understood as him saying the episodic case is a mental event that does not have belief as a component, and the stative case, given the definition he gave, has belief as a component, and the episodic case causes the stative case. That seems to be the best way to understand at least the non-Sanskrit version of it that Stephen has given us in English. Okay, one final argument. If you're aware of the fact that the Nayayikas are generative causal theorists instead of transformational causal theorists, the difference between what's known as Satkaryavada and Asatkaryavada, there's another argument for why the vertical awarenesses do not contain belief in them. So the argument would be episodes of vertical awareness cause states of true belief. That's just what Stephen has told us. According to the Asatkaryavada theory of causation, when A causes B, it's not in virtue of the fact that A already contains B within it. So episodes of vertical awareness do not contain belief in them. Why? Because the episode of vertical awareness causes the true belief. According to this theory, it can't cause a true belief if it contained the true belief in it, right? It's producing something new. That's a generative theory as opposed to the Sankhya transformational theory. So that's basically another argument. Okay. So I think this leads to a correction to my prior work. I think that basically Gangesha splits the difference between Burge and Williamson. So in one sense, uncertified knowledge is like the view that knowledge is its own mental state when we think of Gangesha as offering the episodic account that is the most fundamental component of his own theory. And then when you think of it in terms of the stative version, it looks like it comes close to what Burge is talking about by saying that knowledge is warranted true belief, and what is happening for Gangesha is he's saying that it's a true belief that's caused by a genuine knowledge source that's factive, right? So Burge and Gangesha won't line up on the factivity of warrant because Gangesha thinks it is factive, like Williamson. But in terms of the belief component, the episodic one favors Williamson's theory, and the non-episodic one, which is stative, favors Burge's theory. And that's how Gangesha splits the difference. Not saying it's the best view overall, but it's just one that splits the difference. And so this leads me to a kind of a summary. I think if you want to see why someone in general should take attention first epistemology seriously, you can think about it in terms of what role attention plays in relation to the other three paradigms: belief, agency, and knowledge. So I hope that when a belief matters, it's because attention played a role in its production. When agency matters, it's because the agent exercised attention with respect to an epistemic good. And when knowledge is produced, attention is in the causal etiology of the knowledge source. So these are general reasons for thinking attention is important in epistemology and perhaps deserves a place as a type of first epistemology. And then how does Gangesha satisfy this? Well, he says perception is a direct episodic source of knowledge when perception is in the attentional field. Without attention, perception has no direct connection to knowledge. Seeing is a way of knowing because seeing as a way of knowing involves attentionally accurate awareness of the world. States of uncertified knowledge, which include true belief, are produced by prior episodes of attentionally accurate awareness. This is the fact that the episodic one causes the stative one. And Gangesha offers an account of perception involving attention as a foundation for uncertified state of knowledge, and thus certified state of knowledge, because certified state of knowledge depends on uncertified state of knowledge. His account can be seen as a move toward attention first epistemology in contemporary analytic epistemology. So let me just close by saying I've vacillated here between specific doctrines that are found in Gangesha, in Stephen Phillips's translation, and general ideas about the Nyaya tradition found in Stephen and Jaishankar Shah. I've intentionally clouded that, where that is not good scholarship. If you were just trying to say what a specific Sanskrit epistemologist might have thought about something. But the reason why is I'm trying to get to a level of granularity where we can walk across both of these traditions and see a way of interjecting one into the space of the other. So, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Anand. And we've got time for questions. Please.
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts. So one is about how close Gangesha is to Burge. You were presenting the sort of the certified knowledge as the thing that was close to Burge, but if certified knowledge depends on and as being kind of internalist, but if certified knowledge depends on uncertified knowledge is not internalist, and so anything that's built on it is not really going to be fully internalist, because internalist is the kind of purist notion, and so I think my impression is that Gangesha is actually more, from what you're saying, is more on the more on my side than on Burgess. Just a second point is, if you want a term for the episodic cognition, that I think that the word recognition is pretty good, because recognizing, that is an event, and rather than a state, and
I see. Okay.
but it's also factive, and
yes,
and I think of it as coming to know, but coming to know is itself an event. So I think that might be a better way of kind of
instead of using the word episodic, right?
Sorry?
Yeah, you're saying drop the word episodic and use coming to know.
Well, you can but as it were, if you're talking about rather than talking about episodic knowledge, which is semi a contradiction in terms in English,
Okay.
but episodic recognition is totally fine, and so I think that's a way
Good.
of mapping it onto
I see that.
terminology in English that doesn't have this sort of cognitive dissonance.
Got it.
And the third thing was just about the idea of going attention first. So one thing about attention is that it's not a propositional attitude, and you don't attend that P. You just attend to something, and so it doesn't it doesn't really have the kind of scope that belief and knowledge have epistemologically, and and I think the notion of attentionally accurate is a bit I think the accurate is smuggling in something there, because accurate implies some distinction like that between true and false.
Truth of valuable content.
Yes, but attention it isn't that, and so it's not the attention really that's inaccurately attending to something. It's not the attention that's inaccurate. You might not be attending to it closely enough or something like that. So
yeah,
I'm not. I'm not wanting to exclude attention altogether from the picture, but I'm not sure that the notion of attention has enough resources to be the basis of some, as it were, alternative way of doing epistemology.
Okay, so let's begin with that one, because I do have something to say concretely about it. When I spoke to Nilanjan in India a couple of years ago, he actually said that he thought you could just use the phrase accurate awareness, and that would be sufficient to capture what Gangesha wanted. At that point in time, we hadn't discussed the idea that attention was relevant at all. Right, so this supports the claim that you don't need the attention part. The reason why I introduced it this time is because, as you saw when I listed the positive conditions, I do feel confident those last two conditions are just a way of saying, whatever the Sanskrit version of it is, what attention would be. But now you're pointing out that if you use attention, you don't get a propositional attitude, which allows for a certain type of evaluation. And also, is nothing in the phrase accurate awareness where if you add attentional, the attention bit is doing anything that the accurate part is doing the most of the work, is what you're saying. Is that correct? Yeah, okay. Got it. So I wonder if there is another relation where attending to facilitates accurate awareness of.
Yeah. But I mean, awareness is pretty much just knowledge.
Yeah, I know. You've said this before.
And accurate, and it doesn't need to. I mean, you don't need to
You just
say
have to say
accurate awareness any more than you need to say accurate knowledge.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, I have to reflect on it. So you're basically saying that both qualifiers might be unnecessary completely
Yes.
in terms of getting the precision of what you want. If you just explain what awareness is in the right way, you're done. Yeah, okay. So I got the episodic thing. I think the Nyayikas would be completely on board with talking about episodic recognition because they have a deep theory of recognition, and that's a very good point. I didn't think to use recognition. It does seem odd to talk about episodic knowledge. The reason why the word episodic is crept into literature is because the paper I pointed to by Karl Potter specifically uses this language. So it was a distinction that they drew in the 80s where they tried to say that something about episodic stuff in Indian epistemology makes it different than the... And actually, Jennifer Nagel raised the same point too. She's like, there is this old discussion about this episodic versus stative. But you're right. If recognition can serve those roles and it's consistent with the word episodic, that's good. Okay, now let's go a little bit deeper though on the Burge point, because there's something going on there that's less conciliatory and more sort of has to be right. So it's not clear that once... Okay, let's start with the... So it is true that because at bottom, uncertified is wholly externalist, and as Stephen says concerning Gangesha, he's completely committed to a form of externalism because, as they say in Sanskrit, he's a parata pramanya theorist. He's an external validity theorist. And so there's this deep sense in which, in being a Nyayika, he can't go the other way. So it is deeply externalist. And in that sense, what they now say sometimes is that if there is an internalism in Gangesha, it's one that flows out and is dependent on the externalism. And now you're pointing out that the way we typically understood internalism in the 20th century was sort of like a purist thesis, which meant that the reasons could cut free and everything from the external thing. So whatever type of internalism they have, it's definitely not the pure kind, right? Okay, good. So that's a good clarification I can make. The worry I have, though, is that part of what Burge seemed to do in 1993 and 2003 was to say that we could avoid the internalism and externalism debate by factoring warrant into the externalist entitlement kind and the internalist justification kind. And then he wanted to say that you can warrant a belief in two different ways. And so I'm worried that there's still a sense in which, maybe it's wrong, there's a sense in which some of the Nyayikas want to say there's a concession to the internalist in that in the certification case, we are dealing with reasons, right? And in that case, we are talking about something that's very close to justification. And it is true that those things have to be dependent on this externalist consideration, but it's not as if reasons are not at play. Okay, so now let me push it a little bit further so I can show you something else. So at one point in time, there was this response to the Gettier problem called the no false lemmas response. I think it was Armstrong 1973, where basically the claim was
Clark,
that...
I think earlier.
What?
Clark, much earlier. Actually.
Was it?
Michael Clark, yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. So the idea was that if there was a false claim in the etiology of the reasoning, then that would be a reason to say there was a false lemma, and that would not be good. Sometimes it looks like what Stephen is saying is that Gangesha holds the view that something counts as a reason only if its original origination source was in the right way, and that he's actually just adopting sort of a no false lemmas view of what counts as a reason. So if the causal etiology of a reason has something that's false in the background of it, it's not a genuine reason.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean, actually, my suspicion would be that he's actually much more likely to be following the kind of knowledge first account of reasons that you get in, for example, in a relatively recent paper by Hawthorne and Magador, where a fact is only so you only have a fact as a reason if you know it. And so, I mean, that would explain why, if it's false, it's not a reason for you.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But I mean, it needs to be more than just that it's true. That it actually needs to be something that you know. And I suspect that would fit in better with the epistemology than just making it to do with truth.
Okay, can you say that? So again, you have it's not just that it's true; it's that you know it.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So if it's not true, it's not a fact, and the reason can only be a reason if it's a fact and you know it. Got it. Okay. Thank you. Good.
I have a question, but
Yeah.
there's one that's come in on Zoom.
Okay.
It's in the chat window on Zoom, so I'll just read it out. Dear Professor Vaidya, it is always lovely to listen to your intriguing lectures. However, I have one point of dissatisfaction, i.e., how does your case, combined with Gangesha and analytic epistemology, consider the counter-arguments of metaphysical idealists, epistemological skeptics, and, most importantly, non-perceptual objects such as morality and theology? Further, don't you think that the case you try to develop might face all the counter-arguments that scientism and empirical reductionism also face? If so, how would you take up such challenges?
That's a lot.
This is from Rajan.
What? One more time? I think it'll be better if I can hear it.
Yes, you want to actually read
No. Okay, actually, yeah. Let me just. But okay, it's combined. Okay. Right. So. Okay, I think there's one part of this, two parts of this that I can respond to. So I definitely think that the move from idealism as a counter response to the Nyayikas, where I believe the Nyayikas are right, has to do with the asymmetric dependence of error on truth. So I think that the fundamental idea in Nyaya of the parasitism of error on truth is a way of thinking about how idealism of a certain kind, not all idealisms, could be pushed back on. And the general idea is that our basic way of understanding how something has gone wrong is parasitically explained on it being correct or getting correct sometimes. So truth is primarily what we need to appeal to in responding to something when it's in the false case. And then the skeptic one, I actually have a response to, but I think that the skeptic one takes more time to develop. But I think that the Nyayikas have a general response to epistemological skepticism, which actually borrows from their parasitism of error on truth. And so there's a nice paper by Matthew Dosty on Vatsayana that discusses the difference between skeptic first orientation in epistemology and trust first orientations in epistemology. And the way in which Matthew discusses it, in my recollection, is that if you begin with the skeptic first sort of orientation in epistemology, you're never going to get out of it. But if you begin with a trust first one, you can talk about various versions of skepticism that are harder to respond to and other ones that are easier to respond to, but you're not left in a situation where you have an implausible starting point from which to get out of and discuss knowing in the world. Yeah, so that would be the... How does this relate to scientism? I'm not ready to comment on its relation to something as broad as scientism without a proper definition of it. Yeah.
And just an invitation to anyone else on Zoom, if you have a question, then that's welcome. Either put it in the chat or put your hand up. I just had a question about the slide where you gave those conditions, and some of them were in colour, and it was things like
Yeah, sure.
the presence of functioning external sense faculties and inner sense and
Yep.
contact between various things.
Mm-hmm.
And it was there that you brought in attention
Mm-hmm.
as a sort of gloss on
The last two. They are
Exactly.
contact between the external sense organ and the internal sense organ.
yeah,
And yeah,
exactly. So you have to have contact between the manas
and the
and the self and the manas and the
mm-hmm.
external sense faculty.
Mm-hmm.
Just one thing about talking about that as attention
Mm-hmm.
is that usually we think that we can make a distinction between perceiving something with attention or without attention,
Mm-hmm.
whereas if you don't have that manas, that internal sense, in contact with those two things, then there's absolutely no perception at all.
Right.
So you can't have any perception without
That's
that.
correct. Oh, okay.
So if that just maybe goes against, I don't know if
No,
it's,
I know what you're talking about.
I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing to include attention, but I don't think you're compelled to include attention in order to capture those two kinds of contact, because it doesn't actually quite map the considerations of attention with considerations of that contact, because when that contact is not there, you have absolutely no
No, I know.
perceptual experience.
So
whereas when it,
it's
when attention is not there, you can still have some.
So you've done the Sanskrit internal version of Duncan Pritchard's question to me about this same point. He said to me that so I had a presentation in April for him at his at UCI, and he said, Anand, there's one thing you should worry about here is forget about these conditions, is that there's already a live debate about whether or not perception properly is going on absent attention. And that's already a debate in vision science. And the evidence seems to be quite clear that some people want to say that you can perceive even though you're not attending to or attending with in your perception. And if this theory, those conditions are taken to be an analysis of that idea, then this is strongly saying that in those cases where the attention is not present because those last two conditions aren't satisfied, that there's no perception at all. So it's worse, because at least they'll say there's some kind of thing going on, but this view says no. Now, I actually some days say to myself, this is not a problem, because this theory should be a theory of perception as a way of knowing, and a certain kind of way of knowing. But Tim just said some things that make me think that maybe I ought to not be so happy that attention is doing as much work as I think it is. So what I was trying to say, which maybe is not completely worked out, was that insofar as we want to talk about perception as a way of knowing, and now I can even elaborate in the ways of knowing that Nayayikas are interested in, this way of talking about attention being related is important in that it screens off the other types of things as not even being perception. So one way to say this, yeah, there's perceptual kinds of processes going on, but insofar as this is a theory of, I'll use the bad phrase, episodic knowing, it's okay, because the perception that's supposed to be that kind has to be generated by attention. So there are these worries about whether or not attention is doing any work, which I now have to go consider in more detail. But prior to those considerations, I think there was already some kind of happy way to say that they just aren't interested in that kind of thing, because this theory is supposed to be a theory of pratyaksha pramana, right? And given the way in which we were understanding that, it had to be the case that these conditions were put in place for that, because the type of perception that we might talk about in vision science that happens without attention, I would think, would not count for them as a kind of knowing. And no, but let's complicate it more. Here's the problem, is that we know that the Nayayikas are interested in giving a theory of perception as a direct way of knowing in order to explain one phenomenon, unhesitating action. That's the predominant thing that they're hung up about. It's not clear to me that perception as a way of knowing that relates to unhesitating action requires attention. That's the problem. So it cuts the other way. On the one hand, I want to say it does make sense that they would go down this road. But then when I talk about the phenomenon that they all seem to be interested in explaining, this unhesitating action. It seems like you can have a perceptual state, like having a quick reaction to grab a cup as it's falling, right? Which doesn't have attention in the right way there. So there is tension here. You're just picking it up on it and saying you don't need to do it in terms of attention because of how those phrases unpack in Sanskrit. I agree with you. And Duncan is saying you might overcommit, and then I guess Tim is kind of saying, but is attention even doing any of the real work there? Right. So thank you. I appreciate that.
I mean, another example is driving.
That's
people are, are focused. I mean, they may be, focused on one thing, but they are kind of paying in some way, processing.
Yeah. This is the absent driver case, right?
Absent-minded.
Absent-minded.
But I mean, but not really absent-minded.
Right. I know. I get the joke.
They may be driving perfectly safely, but
exactly.
But not,
you get home and then you realize, how did I get here? Right? Yeah. No, you're right. That's right. Yeah, that's another. Yeah. Hey, by the way, Alex, can you just say? Do you remember what the Sanskrit here is?
For what?
For the when they say contact between the external sense organ and the internal sense organ, it's the manas and the buddhi,
No,
or manas and indriyas.
Manas and indriya.
Indriya. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
So there is one more question here from Krishna Swami.
Oh.
Hi Anand, great talk. Had a question. You briefly mentioned that in Indian epistemology, only the initial perceptual cognition is deemed a legitimate source of knowledge. But if this is the case, that there is a novelty constraint, then does it imply that there can't be deceptive cognition?
That there can't be. No, it does not imply that there can't be deceptive cognition. There clearly are cases where we have deceptive cognition. The claim here is that when it's the case of knowing, it's that it comes across with some fresh news. Can there be deceptive cases? Yeah, I think it's a necessary versus sufficient thing. Can you have deceptive cases of fresh news, or can you only have fresh news in knowledge cases? I think that's the difference between what he's asking. There's nothing here that says you can't have a false cognition or a misleading cognition. What was being claimed here in this sort of period of, even when Stephen is talking about this, is that there seems to be some way where they were talking about knowledge, where knowledge always meant of something new. And so even in the Sanskrit debates, you can see that various people are raising objections like, how does that make it? So in English, in analytic philosophy, we this problem is very clear. Someone will say, testimony is a transmissive source of knowledge. Memory is a preservative source of knowledge. And perception is a generative, and inference is a generative source of knowledge. Okay? But it looks like, according to the Nyayikas and the Mimamsikas, memory isn't a preservative source of knowledge at all, because memory can never be of something that's fresh. And because knowledge is of something that's fresh, memory is eliminated right away. So there is no sense in the Nyayika-Mimamsaka interaction for the notion of a preservative source of knowledge. There is for a transmissive one, but there isn't for preservative, because the fresh news constraint would be violated in the debates between them. And I believe Mimamsakas and Nyayikas don't think memory is a source of knowledge.
They don't think it's a source of knowledge precisely, I would say, because it's only preservative, not generative.
No, no. I think no. You have to say that the other way. You have to say, because it's not generative and knowledge is generative, something that's fresh, it's not knowledge. They don't have a concept of preservative knowledge. I don't think they have that concept.
No, this constraint rules out the
Yes,
possibility.
right. And so sometimes you can see English translators of Sanskrit trying to say this in a way, but really I've come to the conclusion they don't understand what preservative knowledge would be.
But that's because you can't have preservative recognition. But
okay, right.
But you can have preservative. You can preserve the stative.
That's right.
Thing. Which
so
which is the one that is more naturally translated as knowledge.
No, and so I just want to add, I think that's very insightful that you pulled for the recognition one, because if you look at the other words that are used when they talk about things, recognition is a very common translation that is used. So I think you're tracking something that I totally missed, which is the recognitional capacities, recognizing something, and you're right. Preservative doesn't go along with the recognition. That's very
the one problem maybe with recognition is that some people claim that you can have non-conceptual perception, which is pramana. And recognition wouldn't capture that.
Yeah, but this is...
I'm not sure that those people, they might even think that you can have non-conceptual recognition, you know, when I mean, there's kind of one thing that, you know, they're thinking, for example, of shades of colour that you don't have any stable, you know, word for, I mean, other than just by demonstrating it. But you can definitely recognize, you know, you can recognize a shade of colour as, you know, as the very, the very shade that, I mean, because it's a shade that you've encountered before. So, you know, I think if you're going for non-conceptual content perception, you probably go for non-conceptual content of recognition as well.
Are you talking about Nirvikalpaka Pratyaksha?
Yeah.
But Nirvikalpaka Pratyaksha is not pramana.
Well, for some people it is.
For
the
but not the
Buddhists
Nyayikas. Oh, it is. Oh, that's right, it is. Yeah, I know. It is for the Buddhists, it is.
For some Nyayikas like Vachaspati Mishra, he thought you have both.
And both were, but the thing is, it's typical to say that, so the word in English is indeterminate versus determinate perception, where determinate is oftentimes used as conceptual, and indeterminate means non-conceptual. I thought even in Vachaspati, though, the idea was that indeterminate perception is not truth valuable, because it's a form of elemental cognition and not a form of... so that's...
You might be right, yeah.
But I think that there's texture here. So at least... I don't know. So the other thing I was working on the whole time I was here was this stuff about non-conceptual content in the Arindam. So Arindam has a very famous paper where he argues that Nayayikas should just get rid of the whole idea of Nirvikalpaka Pratyaksha. It's very complicated what his reasons are and whether or not they're good, but this is related. What you're talking about in terms of the recognitional capacities is very closely related to what he's saying. And you're right now, I remember. So the Buddhists precisely think that the indeterminate one is the knowledge, and the determinate one is the spoiled infection of your mind onto something that was pure and pristine and raw. And so Vachaspati wants to concede something to the Buddhists as being correct, so he capitulates that indeterminate pratyaksha is actually something important, and then tries to save the other side as being real and genuine too.
That's how I
But when the
understand.
Buddhists are basically saying, you messed it up, it's backwards. The thing that's indeterminate was pure and perfect and the real kind of knowing, and the other thing is the poison of your mind. That's kind of like the infection sort of thing. You're putting the categories which don't really exist in the world because there are no universals, and you're putting them on there. Yeah, that's right. So in terms of the Buddhist kind of response, I guess the idea of recognition and conceptualization then is the point of logical connection that has to be made. Good, thank you. It's helpful. Yeah.
One tiny little extra thing. I thought that the analogy with jade and jadeite and nephrite, it's not perfect because because it doesn't capture the good case, bad case symmetry. I mean, the priority, of truth to error.
Yeah.
And I mean, something that you might think of as a bit better, it would be something like gold and fool's gold.
Oh, okay, sure, yeah.
Where one's categorizing the fool's
gold.
I
see, that's why.
As kind of like gold, but not.
Oh, I see.
Not
So,
gold,
oh, I see. No, that.
Whereas, I mean, jade. It's not that nephrite is
a
fool's,
pair. Yeah, that's right.
jadeite or anything
That's a
like
good
that.
point. That's very insightful. So I think the reason why I got to that point was because it was a taxonomical difference. But you're saying don't just do the taxonomical difference. Talk about the taxonomical difference with the asymmetry of, and then you're right. The fool's gold is precisely that type of example. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I can change that. Thanks.